America, my name is Osei-Frimpong. I come to you live every Friday to talk about the news of the day and do it in a way that will hopefully make your life a little bit more meaningful and clear. The world's very confusing, and make no mistake, there is a large ideological project in these United States that's tied to controlling the black mind. And hopefully you can tune in every Friday, and I will make it, a little bit clearer. And it's tied to controlling the white mind also, but usually it's tied to controlling the white mind in a way that gets them to ignore the justice claims of black people. Because if you haven't noticed, like, we've pretty much wholesale accepted racial stratification as some sort of fact of nature, right? We've just kind of said somehow that, like, this is perfectly appropriate and and I'm saying actually a distribution like this is not appropriate. It's something weird that, like, it's a lot of black men seem to find their way into the criminal justice system, and it seems to be pretty much impossible to convict a white woman of anything. So what's going on? So, like, we have to ask these questions, especially before we start blaming individuals or like groups, just saying, well, black men are criminals and there's something, sugar and spice and everything nice about white women. Well, actually there might be other dynamics at play that could explain a graph like this, right? So I come to you live every Friday to kind of clarify some of our issues and, make the struggle a little bit more clear. Because if you haven't noticed, and this is important, and this is going to tie into the bigger theme of today's lesson, which is going to be on critical race theory. The truth we live by is underdeveloped, right? There's this false binary between true and false. But actually what's going on is truth and then more robust truth, but it's more robust in a way that actually is more true than it was previously. So when I say something like, well, Mackenzie Scott's one of the richest people in the world, and you should probably know that because, like, she might influence your policy. You'll be like, Mackenzie Scott, I don't even know who that is. Well, she's the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, right? So when I just say Mackenzie Scott, you don't know that. You think, oh yeah, well, whoever that is, I can't see her being that influential. When I say the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, now you think, oh, Mackenzie Scott, I have a truer conception of, like, what it means that some random person has, like, billions of dollars to give away every year in charity as a tax write-off. She could either fund my opposition or she's not going to fund my justice claim. So learning more about the object of inquiry's relationships to things that aren't the object actually gives you a truer sense of the object, right? So how is it being the case? Yeah, like I say Mackenzie Scott, you're like, oh, no big deal. When I say Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, you're like, oh, I could see how that could be an issue, right? So we've learned more about Mackenzie Scott by understanding her relationship to something that's not Mackenzie Scott, which is Jeff Bezos and Jeff Bezos' money, right? So there's a way in which, like I said, there are lots of ways this is going to start to become more and more relevant. But just know that as truth becomes as we come to develop a richer understanding of truth, it changes what the object of inquiry is. And I'll tie this directly to critical race theory. For example, one of the founders of critical race theory is a legal scholar by the name of Derek Bell. Derek Bell argued that, like, look, you look at Brown versus Board of Education, and you have to actually look at the context through which that decision emerged. You can't just assume that people and the arguments people were giving and the concerns they had. You can't just look at what we want Brown versus the Board of Education to mean. We have to actually look at, like, what was going on, right? And one of the things that was going on was that we were in the middle of the Cold War. And in the middle of the Cold War, one thing that the Russians would always say to us is like, yeah, but you guys lynch Negroes. Like that was literally the. Go ahead and Google that phrase, and you lynch Negroes. It turns out it's like a big old joke, and you lynch Negroes, and you lynch Negroes. Yeah, it's got its own Wikipedia, and you are lynching Negroes. It's like it's a Russian phrase to combat any sort of like moral claim that America has. Right, and it's actually there's a Polish version of it, and you lynch Negroes. There's a at the bottom of the article. There's a Czech version of and you lynch Negroes. There's a Hungarian version, but it's a joke among the entire Eastern European world, post-Soviet world, that whenever America says something, you can just respond back and you lynch Negroes. So like, hush, right? And the problem was we were in the middle of the Cold War, and the developing world was looking at the way we pretty much were like a colonial state with an internal colony of black people, and it made the moral argument for American capitalism and American intervention harder to make for developing nations, And like, you have to understand at that time, Russia was looking at, it was a very funny, this is some Russian propaganda concerning the Americas and how like Americans live with respect to the fact that like, in the U.S. we lynched Negroes. It's a little bit small, but you see what I'm talking about. Yeah, this was the propaganda. So in order to get rid of the moral argument, we had to actually have a policy that was somewhat supportive of black people in the United States. So the CIA and to some extent the FBI had an interest in, and the American anti-communists had an interest in at least the formal appearance of the United States not being a colonial state that terrorized black people. And Derek Bell argues that that's what actually governed the he says without anti-communism there wouldn't have been a Brown versus Board of Education. Like there wouldn't have been like Jim Crow wouldn't have gone down. The civil rights movement wouldn't have happened. So first of all those people who say shame doesn't work, shame absolutely works. We were scared of being ashamed in the eyes of those countries we wanted to invade. But we wanted to invade them nicely. We wanted to protect them from communism, right? But we had to blunt the argument that the United States is a bad moral actor by actually doing good, somewhat good by, American black people, right? And so for Derek Bell, he's like, that accounts for the interest convergence, and this becomes an important theory in critical race theory, the interest convergence that accounts for the passage of Brown versus Board of Education. So all these stories we tell about how the Warren Court was just applying the law and there weren't any exogenous or external concerns that they were worried about really is it's not true, right? The law underdetermines its application. And we're going to talk more about that and the relationship between critical race theory and critical legal theory after the beat.
To the beat, y'all.
Yeah. Sound good to me. Never change the ways for the world or the government. If I was the president, then I would state facts. You leave it up to me, I paint the White House black and I'm featuring your front.
To the beat, y'all.
All right, so what is critical race theory? The target of critical race theory is equality of legal formalism. What is legal formalism? It's this idea that you can the content of what you're adjudicating doesn't matter if you're applying a legal form, right? The content is irrelevant, right? That's going to be a problem. And critical theory, you can have critical boxing theory. What's critical boxing theory going to look like? Well, it's going to say that, well, if you want to evaluate boxers' skills, you can just have them fight each other in a boxing match. And then you'll know who the better boxer is. And then the critical boxer theorist will be like, well, actually, this person's 115 pounds and this person's 255 pounds. So what will be decided in that fight isn't going to be the boxer's skill. It's going to be overdetermined by their weight differential, right? So the critical boxing theory will be like, if we actually care about testing boxing skill, we can't have it be overdetermined by weight differentials. We need to have weight classes. We need to talk about treating. We have to actually look at the content of the fighters. We can't just apply the method, because what the method will do, if we just apply it to everyone, it will just it'll give us a distorted reality about the truth about the fighter's skill, right? Because it'll be determined by this external source of inequality. So you can say the fight will be equal insofar as they're both fighters and they're both boxers and they will be boxing, but it'll be a quality of equality that masks standing orders of inequality, right? So there's a way in which you can talk about equality under the law that actually masks really and actually calcifies, not only masks, but calcifies orders of inequality. And this is one reason why, developing states like oligarchs in developing states like constitutional regimes, because constitutional regimes protect property rights. And that means everyone could be equal under the law. But if I have property rights, but if I have a disproportionate amount of property, that means I could kind of rule over the people who don't have any access to any property. So there's a way in which equality under the law, insofar as they'll just support property rights, actually calcifies injustice if the actual arrangement of if there's a huge discrepancy in the amount of property people have access to own. Right? There's another example of this. I mean, there's a famous quote by Anatole France who pretty much says, the law and its majestic equality bars everyone, the rich and the poor of life, from begging on the streets, from sleeping under bridges, and from stealing. So there's a way in which that kind of equality ranges over the poor and the rich alike, but it does so in a way that actually disproportionately limits the opportunities of the poor and strengthens the power relationship and the power of the wealthy over the poor. Because now the poor can't find other ways to sleep. They have to go to the wealthy person and kind of negotiate on the wealthy person's terms. And the wealthy person now has the state saying that you have to rent from me. You can't. The person with a surplus house, you can't sleep under a bridge. You have to rent from me or I'll call the cops. Right? So there's a way in which equality under the law knows the options of the poor person, the inability to sleep under a bridge. It becomes illegal now, while also calcifying the ability of the wealthy person to turn the poor person into a tool of the wealthy person's interests. Right? So formal equality isn't really can be an institution of injustice, right? So one of the targets of critical race theory is formal equality. Another way formal equality is an institution of injustice is that the facts underdetermine their application, right? So this is something that you see in all minors of critical theory. When I'm hit with an event or a fact, I'm hit with all of it, right? And in order to determine what someone's innocence or guilt, I have to pick and choose among the welter of facts, the manifold presentation of facts, and decide which one's relevant and which one's not, right? Because legally, I could use this fact to make this determination, or I could use this fact to make that determination. I have to decide, no, this one's more important than that. And that's not itself a legal, that's not just merely applying a law to an instance. It's making a judgment about which one of these facts is the relevant one for my case, right? And depending on that judgment, you can ground different verdicts, right? So it's going to be about the discretion of the judge, about like what the judge thinks is important. Because we have the law underdetermines its application, and many of the facts that are presented to you can justify different determinations. This is why actually the judge matters, because different judges looking at the same case, both applying the law, can come to different reasonable verdicts, different legal verdicts, right? That not necessarily will be overturned because they're both applications of the law. You can say, well, precedent changes that. Actually, precedent doesn't really change that either, because no two cases are exactly alike. So even choosing which precedent is the applicable precedent for this situation is going to be a matter of including some aspects of this situation and of that precedent, and including some aspects and excluding other aspects of this situation and that precedent, right? So precedents also underdetermine their application. So we've decided that whatever judges do, it's not necessarily a matter of merely applying the law to an instance. There are going to be other concerns because the law doesn't apply itself. There's not only going to be other concerns, there are going to be other things going on, because I have to decide what is the relevant aspect of this case before me. And that's not something the law is going to tell you necessarily, right? And not necessarily exclude multiple possible determinations that could emerge legally, right? So how does race figure into this? Well, we can't be formalists about race and ignore the fact of different cultural and material inheritances, right? The idea that you could have a law that you can have a law that extends over all of the races in America, that is not sensitive to the degraded conditions and exalted conditions of some of the races in America, but that law is somehow equal, is just not, it's not real. It's an abstract. You've abstracted away the real circumstance of the people, in the same way that the person who says, well, I want to find out the best boxer, so I'll just let the boxers box, and without actually paying attention to the weight differential of the 113-pound boxer and the 215-pound boxer, that person's not really serious about getting to a real answer. Like, a real answer is going to be sensitive to all of the relationships, not just the abstract similarity that they're both boxers, but it's going to be sensitive to all of the relationships, including the relationship that 115 pounds has to, physics relative to 155 pounds, right? And the power that can be generated in a punch. So critical race theory the target of critical race theory is going to be this kind of formalism that abstracts from the content of the participants involved and the actual relationships of the participants involved. Right? So I hope that's clear. And you have to understand that people are going to fight against that because, and by the way, two books on this that are really good are the Derek Bell reader. Derek Bell is a fantastic critical race theorist, and this one's not bad either. Critical Race and Introduction. Critical Race Theory and Introduction. And why people are going to fight against it, because you have to understand that there's a way in which we've made whiteness a property. We've made whiteness a property. And so if you don't have any other property, you still have property in your whiteness. And if what critical race theory might do, it might devalue the asset value of your whiteness, which means people are worried about their property values, right? And one of the properties they have is their whiteness, and they don't want that whiteness devalued, even if it means like, you know, the truth and justice. And so what we have is a kind of an underdeveloped conception of history. For example, the 1619 Project. 1619 Project says, like, look, you look at the revolutionary, you look at the actual context of the revolutionary moment. Sure, you had people worried about self-governance and all of that stuff, but you had a lot of Southerners worried about their property rights. And what you had, I mean, explicitly worried about their property rights. And the Crown in London's ability to just raise taxes or haul people off or confiscate property. So and mind you, the colonists, when they think about property, they're thinking about us. They were thinking about black people. And so in London at the time, in 1772, they had just had the Somerset Verdict. Now, the Somerset Verdict, what it did was abolished slavery in London proper, right? It abolished slavery in England proper. Not in the colonies, but in England. And they kind of looked at what was going on in London, and they were thinking, well, you know, if they abolished slavery unilaterally over there, if we are under their legal system, they have the authority to abolish slavery in all the colonies, which would instantly jeopardize, and without asking us, would instantly jeopardize all of my property holdings. And if you know anything about white people, you know that they like their property holdings. So the Somerset Verdict in 1772 was actually very threatening. And it's not an accident that all of these, you know, slave-owning Virginians were very interested in governance. They were interested in governance for different reasons than the guys in Massachusetts. Not necessarily nicer, but you have to understand that the South was just a bunch of fiefdoms. Slaveholding, like little fiefdoms. And they didn't care about town hall meetings and like robust governance. No, they wanted their property. They wanted their property and their Negroes secured. And not what they didn't want is their property and their Negroes jeopardized by some British judge who decided that the colonies weren't going to have slaves either because it was un-English. It was we are English people. We do not have slaves. And that would be fine, but Americans wanted their slaves. White Americans wanted their slaves. Right? So he's not saying that the 1619 Project wasn't arguing that like that was the determinative reason necessarily, but that factored in the same way that anti-communism factored into Brown versus Board of Education. We wanted to look good in Brown versus Board of Education. We wanted to look good to the third world so that we could blunt ourselves from the argument that the USSR was launching at us that, like, you know, don't listen to the United States. They're all a bunch of hypocrites. They lynch their Negroes. So, like, that also factored in to the civil rights movement. Was it alone? Was that alone? Could the Cold War alone account for the civil rights movement and the relative successes but ultimate failures of the movement? Well, depending on who you talk to, yes. But was it a contributing factor? Absolutely. Anti-communism was absolutely a contributing factor to the public and the elite need to at least appear to not be a terrorist state. And property security was absolutely a contributing factor to the colonists' need to emancipate themselves from the crown. Right? They wanted their property secure. And make no mistake, when they say property, they mean us. Reread the Declaration of Independence. When they're talking about taxes and property and controlling their rights, they're talking about they're controlling their rights to control us. And those were the rights in jeopardy. Those were the rights in jeopardy. So, critical race theory takes its major target as a quality of formalism that abstracts from the actual content and the actual function of and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, of the object of inquiry, right? And uncritical race theory will just kind of ignore the relationships. It'll say you can know about Mackenzie Scott without knowing that she is Jeff Bezos's just by meeting her and talking with her. And the fact that she's Jeff Bezos' ex-wife doesn't confer any knowledge or any more robust account of truth of who she is. Yeah, actually it does. It does. Having a conversation with Mackenzie Scott is one thing. Having a conversation and access to a conversation with Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, the multi-billionaire, that's a different kind of thing. She doesn't stop becoming Mackenzie Scott, but she becomes more. I have a richer conception of the truth of what I'm dealing with now. Right? So if you learn about anti-communism and Brown versus Board of Education, you have a richer conception of what was going on, and especially if you want to repeat that kind of racial progress, you have a richer conception of what actually was the context that allowed that sort of racial progress to happen. If you want to have a richer conception of the American Revolution, you should know that 1772, the Somerset Verdict actually was on people's minds. It was in 1772. It was on people's minds about slavery is kind of going on the way out. It's becoming déclassé. It's already officially banned in England proper. It might come to the colonists. And if all of your money is in Negroes, if all of your livelihood and your aspirations for your kid is to be rulers of slaves, and make no mistake, that was a lot of people's aspiration in these United States, to be rulers of slaves. It's funny because women couldn't hold property except their slaves. They didn't have to see the women could hold you could bequeath slaves to your daughter, and they would always be your daughters, not your daughter's husbands. So it was a big deal. Also, the Dunmore Proclamation, that was the kind of the governor / general, the English general, the guy named Dunmore of the Virginia Territory. Yeah, the Virginia Territory said, look, if you fight for us, English people, against the colonists who want to abscond away from the crown, we'll free you. Right, so the English people were offering emancipation. And so that absolutely, the control of black people, and a lot of black people took them up on that offer. So the Dunmore Proclamation and the concern about the Somerset Verdict destabilizing colonial property relationships, and property relationships meaning us, and property interests, those absolutely had a contributing factor to the American Revolution. But if you just look at a formal account of it, and you don't look at the relationships that the founding fathers had to actual black people, and you just think, well, they just wanted to govern themselves, let's not talk about their relationships to their slaves, then you'll miss what's at issue, right? So what you get in uncritical race theory is a very underdeveloped and dangerously underdeveloped and viciously underdeveloped account of how race actually functions in America. And we talk about America being an unfinished product, but we don't talk about how unfinished products or underdeveloped accounts of history and underdeveloped accounts of truth are actually dangerous. You have to think of America as an unfinished product in a way that a construction site is an unfinished project. A construction site is an unfinished project, but it's also very dangerous for people who don't have access to hard hats, and it's unfinished in a way that's dangerous. Or you can think of the lychee fruits and acai berries. There are some berries that, if they're underripe, they're actually dangerous. They're still those kinds of berries, but they're underripe. And they're dangerous, right? So that's the kind of truth that we're telling people. It's underdeveloped. A quality of underdeveloped truth, because it doesn't tease out the relationships and the interests that are at play. And that kind of underdeveloped truth actually completely distorts everyone's conception of reality. I mean, we have a conversation about wealth in the United States that just talks about wealth that people make from earning and money they happen to have, not the wealth they get from marrying, not the wealth they get from inheritance. There are lots of ways that wealth moves, and only one of them is through a job. right? But if we narrow the conversation to just movement through a job, you'll have a true account of wealth distribution in the United States, but it will be fundamentally underdetermined in such a way that it'll be distortive. You'll be confused about how someone who makes as much as you at the job can afford a house that is much more than you make, right? But because you're not thinking about, well, their spouse's grandparent died and that left them an inheritance that they made a down payment that now they have rental properties, and you're like, but we work the same jobs. Well, the idea that you're just the same because you work the same job masks all of the ways in which you're not the same, because the person you're working the same job with has a spouse whose grandfather made a ton of money, and one wealthy white grandfather dying can secure an entire clan, because that's the kind of money they're rolling in relative to everybody else. All right, so we can, and then some people will say race was just a social construct. Yeah, but so are traffic lights. Traffic lights are a social construct, but just ignore them. See how it works. Well, if you ignore traffic lights, just a social artifact. You ignore traffic lights. What will happen is you'll end up with a lot of traffic tickets. You'll be in a fiery crash. Just because it's a social construct doesn't mean that it's not objectively powerful, right? And so a quality of legal formalism will be we outlawed real estate agents from being racist, but we didn't change any of the incentive structures for real estate agents. We didn't actually change any of the content of the job. So we can outlaw real estate agents from being racist, but that's not going to do anything for neighborhood segregation, because the real estate agent makes their money off a commission, and commission's going to come from being the kind of real estate agent who understands the customer's racism without actually having to make the customer or the client be explicit about their racism, right? That's how you get to be a real estate agent who's a good fit. You have to understand your client's racism without being explicit in your client's racism. So you could formally outlaw it, but since you haven't changed any of the incentive structures, the real estate agent still has an interest in, racializing the houses that they show to, prospective clients, especially prospective white clients. Because like I said before, white people have their property isn't just the stuff they own, it's also their whiteness, right? And that was the deal that elite whites who actually had more property gave to poor whites who didn't have propertyless whites. They gave them the property in their whiteness. But in order for that property in the whiteness to have value, it's got to be valued relative to the degradation of blackness, right? So no matter what, you can rule over Negroes. That was the deal that elite whites gave to propertyless whites, and propertyless whites take it because it's not that bad to rule over Negroes. Pretty good. I get to rule over someone. I get to have some sort of power. And they're not going to jeopardize that property or have that property be devalued. They got the property they have in their whiteness, or have that property be devalued because, we're Americans. We like that property. And it serves as an insurance policy for elite whites, right? Let's say elite whites lose everything. They won't lose their whiteness. So they still have something relative to black people, which means they could still use black people as tools for their white aspirations. So if you try to actually understand legal verdicts or colorblind policies without actually seeing how all of these other social and political institutions have an interest in this particular verdict, right? The CIA has an interest in the Brown versus Board of Education, right? The Virginia planters have an interest in the stable institution of slavery, right? And if you just ignore all of those interests that all of these non-legal institutions have in legal proceedings, then you have a misunderstanding of how legal proceedings are determined, right? Or how anything is determined, right? So if you don't understand the interest in the Virginia planters' interest in having secure property rights relative to the Crown's tendency at this time to abolish slavery, then you misunderstand like the impetus for the American Revolution. If you don't know about anti-communism, you misunderstand and misapprehend the Brown versus Board of Education. So, critical race theory, once again, like I said, take anything out of this last half hour, take the critical race theory's target is a quality of formalism that abstracts from the content of real powerful relationships and like real effective relationships and real meaningful relationships, and judges based on categories that are abstracted from the fact of power, right? It would be the equivalent of, and I said this at the beginning, it would be the equivalent of saying, I want to figure out who's the best boxer. I'll just put these people in, while abstracting out the fact that one of them weighs 115 pounds and the other one weighs 250 pounds. And you just put them into fight. And you're thinking, well, whoever wins is because they, worked hard. I'm like, no, that's not actually what's doing the work. The weight differential is contributing to the outcome of that fight. Right. And so you'll have a lot of white people who actually like the unjust distribution of resources, and they like the stories they tell themselves about the unjust distribution of resources. And a lot of white parents are going to be upset because it jeopardizes their legacy. White kids actually aren't that bad. I mean, whatever. But they actually they don't actually feel bad learning about the legacy of whiteness. It's the parents. Whereas for the uncritical race theory, the kids, when they have this underdeveloped understanding of the truth, they blame themselves, right? So black kids blame themselves for everyone, for being degraded. And so you need critical race theory if you actually want to dignify black kids. But it might end up shaming the stories. It makes it harder for white parents to tell themselves the stories that white parents like to tell their kids in order to keep the grift going and sustainable through the generations. And you have to understand a few things about white supremacy. One, it's a system of differentiated institutions, differentiated mutually reinforcing institutions. And white supremacy as a system of differentiated mutually reinforcing institution means that if you just take out one of those white supremacist institutions, the others will cover for it. And if you're a threat to any of the institutions, the others will feel that threat in a specific way. So critical race theory will threaten white parents who primarily identify themselves as parents. It'll threaten the white family. Well, the white family is part of a is part of an institution of white supremacy. And so anything that takes out white supremacy is going to feel like a threat, a specific threat to the white family. It's going to threaten the white church. Well, the white church has a lot to, the white church is a bit of a mess. They have a lot to atone for. I'm looking for the picture I sometimes use of, the Klan meeting that, a lot of Klan meetings happened in churches just because they were community spaces. But, there's like a Klan meeting during a service where everyone brought their robes to, there's like Stewardship Sunday and then like Klan Sunday, where everyone brought their robes to church one day. And there's a great picture of that. Right. So it's going to destabilize that. It's going to destabilize the stories people tell themselves about all of their institutions, insofar as all of their institutions, their jobs, stories they tell themselves about their jobs, stories they tell themselves about their school and their education and their grades. It'll destabilize all the stories white people tell themselves about the merit of themselves relative to other people. And it'll be felt in a very specific way. Critical race theory will somehow seem like unchristian but it'll only seem unchristian if your Christianity is really about white supremacy. right? Critical race theory is going to seem unfamily, but it'll only be be a threat to your family if your family is really just an institution of white supremacy or is substantively an institution of white supremacy. It'll seem anti-academic if, like, your understanding of academics is, racist, right? So or you think the purpose of school is to make, white parents feel good about the stories they have to tell their kids. That's not the purpose of schools. The purpose of schools is to kind of learn truth and raise responsible citizens who can do justice by each other in this project of, shared governance in the United States. So I hope now you could talk about critical race theory. You can get either of these two books. In this book, there's a great essay on racial realism, which means you can't talk about race in the abstract. You have to talk about race as how it actually functions. And how it actually functions. And it's actual social dynamics. You can't talk about we're colorblind now. It's equality under the law. A justice that's blind is a justice that's markedly unjust. I need justice that sees. I need justice. Good. Yeah, that's great. I need justice that sees. Because a justice that's blind is overly abstract. That it's not going to see with any sort of perspicacity the situation that black people are in. All right. Thank you for your time, and don't abstract from the content of actual power relations. Also, people who say that violence never works and shame never works, those people are silly because they've abstracted from they've strategically picked all of the ways in which violence has worked and shame has worked. It doesn't work all the time in all the ways, but yeah, it often contributes to working. Especially in terms of racial justice, because white people don't give too much up for free. So thank you. If you appreciate anything I do, which I think you should, go ahead and go over to www.funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month. Because I did put in some reading, and I want to keep doing good shows that will increase the quality of your political discourse. And thank you for your time. And I will talk to you next week.